These series take place every Tuesday, the last one of each month, over the noon hour. And to join the mailing list, you can contact Brittany at outreach@ctcns.com, and she'll let you know the links for all of the sessions. All of our sessions are now recorded, and they're made available online at the YouTube link that's posted there. Today's session is an additional lecture due to the COVID implications. We're just throwing an extra one in so that we keep contact going. And this lecture is on setting up a lot scouting program. We're well into April now, and normally it would have been recommended that scouting begin mid-March and go on throughout the growing season. This presentation will cover the basics of crop scouting, as well as the common problems on Nova Scotia Christmas tree lots. At the end, I'll take a look at see what's in the chats and the Q&A box in case there's any questions about specific symptoms, diseases, pests, and so on. And we can go back to those and talk about each one individually more thoroughly if that's needed. So crop scouting is just a fancy word for making observations on your lots. The use of the term implies that observations are being made scientifically, and they're based on fair representative samples, and that they're being recorded so progress can be tracked. Crop scouting on Christmas tree lots should be done at least on a bi-weekly basis during the growing season, but it can start as early as January if the temperatures are starting to warm up. Over time, you should begin to have an idea of when the pests that you're monitoring for start to emerge, as well as what areas of your lot are the most susceptible. So what are we looking for when we're crop scouting? I think it's pretty fair to assume that when we walk through our lots, we make mental notes about anything that seems off, but we don't necessarily look for it or even bother recording it sometimes. When you're walking through your lots with the intent to do crop scouting, you should be looking for things that are off and making note of them. Usually you can identify that visually through coloring or foliage damage, but sometimes we can't see everything. It's important to be collecting a sample of the pests and disease problems that might be present so that you can identify them if there is an outbreak later on. To get a better look, we should all have a dedicated scouting toolbox. Here's a basic checklist for creating that. You'll need a notebook or paper and a pen, potentially even prepared data sheets, and we'll talk about that in a bit. You should have a map of the site that you can mark up when you're out and about, so you can mark specific locations where you found issues with trees or wetter areas. You need a board to help you find pests. You'll be beating the foliage across this board to dislodge any present insects. So you're going to need something with a white or black base. You can use a clipboard with white printer paper on it. That works pretty well. Or you could even rig up an embroidery hoop with covered fabric. And I've even tried to do it with an old window screen. You just throw some fabric over it, and you just need to have enough surface area that when you beat the brush across, any insects that are dislodged will show up to you and be more obvious. You should have flagging ribbon with you and bags or envelopes for sampling foliage in case you need to. You might even want to carry around some soil boxes and a soil probe in case you run into a problem area that you think is a soil problem. A hand lens is also a good tool to include in your scouting kit. A 10x magnification should be enough, and you can even get some with multiple lenses and LED lights. I'll show you some examples of that at the end of the presentation when I switch the screen back. You should also be taking a camera with you and a GPS if you have one that you're comfortable using. This will help you mark trees with problems so that you can find them quickly later. I usually use the Google Map app on my cell phone to create a location marker as well as take photos, which I scribble all over on my phone too so that I know what I was looking at. The last thing on this list too that I did want to mention is sanitizer. I'm suggesting that you carry a bleach solution with you to sanitize your tools in between trees, especially if you're sampling for disease problems. Your hard work doing all this scouting to get ahead of problems will be a waste of time if you're spreading disease across your whole lot and into other fields. When you're out scouting, make sure you are committed. You don't need to sample every individual tree, but the trees that you do select to sample should be getting a thorough look over. You should be beating the brush over your board at the top, the middle of the tree, and the bottom of the tree, and recording anything that falls on that board. You can even take pictures. You should be looking at the tree from a distance, from up close, with and without your hand lens. You should be taking pictures, marking locations, writing your observations, and flagging any problem trees. You should be taking samples of anything you aren't sure about, and you should be doing it regularly. There's a photo here That's one needle under magnification in the lab. You can see two distinct lines of spores there. That pattern is the difference in the fungal species that causes a needle cast. So if you don't have all those patterns memorized and you don't have a hand lens, you're going to need a sample in the field. So you need to be prepared to take foliage samples. I mentioned that you might want to make a field data sheet. You can design this to whatever system works for you. This is an example, and you'll notice I've made some notes about pretty much everything. I've referenced what number the photo of the tree was in my camera roll on that first row. I've noted that I took a sample, and I wrote down what I thought the problem was and why, as well as the location. So if you're going to do this and make field data sheets, make sure you have enough room to record all of your important observations, and make sure you're going to remember what you wrote down later on when you get home and you're trying to figure out what was happening. Which comes up to record keeping. You need to be really diligent with your record keeping. When you're out in the field, write down every silly thing you can think of, because when you get home and you're trying to make a diagnosis, you might need to know exactly where the problem was, because there might be a 10-foot swamp area in your lot according to the soil map. And if you don't remember where that problem tree was, you don't know if that's the solution. You might have had a tussock moth outbreak along the edge in 2012 and you think it might be back. So you need to keep records over time and be able to refer to them regularly to help you pinpoint the problem. That's an example of a site map that I drew there. It doesn't need to be fancy. You can see I've just included road work. There's a spot there that says new seedlings, so you know the different ages of the trees that you have in your lots. There's a wet spot there. It's whatever you think you need to remember, make sure you're recording it, and it's helpful to have it on a map so that you can look back at it and find it quickly. So when you do finally get to the diagnostic stage, you'll have a list of symptoms that the true problem could probably be caused by at least 3 different things, maybe even spanning different categories as listed here. So the categories that you see on this slide are based on the Pacific Northwest Extension publication, Identifying and Managing Christmas Tree Diseases, Pests, and Other Problems. There's a PDF version of this online in both English and Spanish, and it's a great resource. You can see from this picture though, whatever that one individual problem is you're trying to identify, it could be caused by a variety of factors, including insects, tree disorders, diseases, and damage from a slew of environmental as well as management factors. And usually these span multiple categories. So we'll talk a bit about each of these broken down, and then we'll go more into depth in a second. Mechanical damage is going to come from equipment. So either someone drove too close to the trees and brushed them with a tire or loader, what have you, or you've got dull shears and you didn't get a clean cut when you were out shearing. Could be a variety of things, but usually you can tell because the damage will be isolated in one spot on the tree, either where the tire brushed it or everywhere that you sheared that tree. Vertebrate damage, which includes damage from deer, moles, mice, any number of creatures that call your lot home or pass through. That damage is sometimes pretty obvious, like antler rubs on a tree with bark or rabbit feeding on seedling stems. So you might be able to identify that right away, but sometimes it's more difficult to determine the actual cost of the problem. Chemical damage is another category that should be considered. This mainly refers to herbicide and fertilizer burn, which this damage should be mostly at the location of application. So if you have a consistent burn where you sprayed herbicide last year, then it's likely that that's the problem, which comes back to that record keeping. You need to know what happened that made a change. Weather damage. This can be a factor as well. If you have trees along a main road and you see a lot of damage in the spring, then they might have been hit with road salt. Frost is another one that I think most of us are fairly familiar with and good at identifying now, and that one can be seen over multiple growing seasons. Drought and heat are another one that are coming into play as well. And you can see these are some very basic symptoms of what you would see associated with each of these weather events, but it's definitely something to keep in mind when you see consistent injury across the field. Tree disorders. Disorders are categorized here as needle losses and deaths, as well as some multicolored mulching that we sometimes see. These can be caused by a number of different things and can often be a result of a separate problem too. So each of these disorders is listed here have multiple species that cause them, and they're all broken out later on. All right, I've got a slide on insects here. Obviously, it doesn't cover all of them, and if you're interested in any one specifically, type it into the Q&A and let me know, and we'll try to elaborate. But what's important for this slide here is that there are a lot of insects that cause similar problems, and they can be hard to find. This is where your board's going to come in. Because different insects will have different life cycles and sometimes multiple stages, your lots are going to be affected at different times of the year. If we're going to talk about insects, I think it's also important to mention beneficial insects. So these are the ones that we're happy to see, and they should be noted too. Now, these are usually predatory insects, so not only are they in natural control, but their presence could also indicate a problem as well. So where there are predators, there is prey. So you should be recording notes of any beneficial insects you see as well. Last category, diseases. These are some of the major ones. This list is certainly not exclusive, but these are a few that you should be conscious of. Usually they will be associated with wetter areas, which is why we recommend good drainage for lots. All right, so diagnosis might not always be simple. You may find an insect that you can quickly identify, but you also might not. So some of the questions that you should be asking when you're scouting include thorough lists of symptoms, consideration of what category you think the problem might fall into. So for example, if you see problems by your new road, it's likely that it could be mechanical damage and not a weather event or a needle cast. If you're keeping good records, you can look back and see if you've dealt with something similar or find out if you know someone who has. For example, if your neighbor had an insect outbreak last year and now you're seeing the same problems, that might be a sign. But you need to be certain in your diagnosis. That might mean you need to send samples off, or you need a second opinion, or you need to refer to another resource. But it's worth being absolutely sure when you make decisions, because the controls for these problems are usually expensive, they're usually time-consuming, and there might be an underlying reason that will come back even after you've managed to control it. I'm going to show you the hand lenses first. I have two of them here. I went into the office yesterday. Nobody was in there, so I just went in and grabbed my lenses. There's two here. Both are pretty good. They both have a 10x magnification on them and a couple of other options, but I usually only use the 10x in the field. And I have, I also grabbed some samples that I had of needles. So these are from October, so they're pretty dry, but I'm going to try to show you the difference with the hand lens here. So bear with me, I'm trying to stick it to my hand so that I can actually show you. All right. Yeah, so that's the 10x there. And you can see those two lines as spores. This was the same demonstration picture that I had in the slideshow. But they're pretty dried up now. I talked a little bit about having a board. So you can do what you like to set up a board. I just use a clipboard and I've got printer paper on it. I've got a couple of elastics on there to hold it on when it's windy. And all that you need to do when you go out to the field is just put this board kind of parallel to the tree and just kind of hit the brush directly against it, and that'll dislodge any insects that are in it, and then you'll be able to see them. And I always take a picture of them just in case I'm not sure what they are and want to look when I get back. The other thing that's pretty handy to have in the field, I mentioned you want to take a map with you. So I usually carry that on another clipboard. It does not have to be fancy. That's the one that was in the slideshow. This isn't actually a field, it's just a sample. But what you want to have in there is your road system, the general shape of the field, any places that have different aged growth throughout them. So you want to label that, or when they were planted, or the approximate height of the trees in there. Any spots that are wet, so if you have a swampy area, you want to make sure that you have that labeled on your map. And you want to mark any problem trees. If you don't have a GPS or you're not comfortable using the GPS on your phone, you can flag the tree and then record it on your map. And that should be enough information for you to go to find it again. If you don't think that'll be enough to help you remember, then you can always GPS the location, and I can give recommendations if you're interested in purchasing a GPS, or I can teach you how to do it on your cell phone too, if that's what you would prefer. On the 28th, we've got Corey Roberts joining us to demonstrate the Provincial Landscape Viewer, which is a free online application for Nova Scotia that lets you map your property and all the characteristics about it. And then at the end of May, we're doing a discussion on handling of exported trees in warmer climates.